The city never truly sleeps, but from this high up, in his bed, it holds its breath. The first thing I always notice is the silence, a thick, expensive quiet that smothers the sirens and the noise from the streets below. Then comes the scent, a suffocatingly sweet mix of his cologne, my perfume, and the musky, sharp aroma of sex. It clings to the silk sheets, to my skin, a ghost of the frantic moments that came before. He is asleep beside me, his breathing deep and even. Julian Thorne. Even in the dim light filtering through the floor to ceiling windows, his profile is sharp, unforgiving. The architect of my ruin, sleeping like an innocent. I look at him, at the dark hair falling across his forehead, at the strong line of his jaw. There's no sign of the ruthless businessman my father despises, no hint of the predator who dismantled my family's latest venture piece by piece. There is only the man whose hands just an hour ago traced constellations of fire across my back, whose mouth whispered my name like a prayer and a curse. My body still hums with the aftershocks of his touch, a deep, resonant pleasure that feels both like a homecoming and a desecration. A cold, hard weight on my left hand brings me crashing back to earth. The diamond on my engagement ring catches the distant city lights, winking at me like a malevolent eye. It feels heavier tonight, a shackle reminding me of Liam. Good, dependable Liam, who probably thinks I'm networking at some late-night gallery opening, the dutiful fiancée playing her part. This act, this silent, tangled moment in Julian's bed, isn't just a betrayal of one man. It's a treason of the highest order. It's a declaration of war against my own father, Arthur Vance, a man whose hatred for Julian is the stuff of corporate legend. To sleep with him, it's like taking a knife and plunging it not just into my father's back, but into the very heart of his legacy. I slide from the bed, my limbs feeling heavy, used. The cool air on my naked skin is a shock, a baptism of guilt. I find my clothes scattered on the floor, a trail of my unraveling. As I pull on my dress, I catch my reflection in the dark glass of the window. The woman staring back is a stranger. Her hair is a mess, her lips are swollen, and just below my ear, a dark purple mark is blooming, a flag planted by an invading army. This isn't Alara Vance, the curator, the daughter, the fiancée. This is someone else, a shadow, a traitor. And as I stand there, suspended between the sleeping enemy in my bed and the indifferent city below, a single, silent scream echoes in my soul. How did I ever let it come to this? Before the scent of Julian's skin became the air I needed to breathe, there was another scent, another life. It smelled of money, fresh-cut flowers, and a faint, cloying perfume of expectation. It was the scent of my engagement party, just 6 months ago, though it feels like a lifetime. To understand the fall, you must first understand the gilded cage I so willingly helped build around myself. My life, until Julian, was a masterpiece of careful curation. I had a respectable, even admirable job as a manager at a prestigious art gallery, a position that allowed me to engage with beauty but never with chaos. It was a role my father, Arthur Vance, approved of, seeing it as a sophisticated hobby, a suitable pastime for a woman of her station before she settled into her primary role as a wife. And the man destined to be my husband was Liam Sterling, the human equivalent of a blue-chip stock, reliable, handsome in a way that never offended, and from a lineage so pristine it was practically a brand. He was the perfect choice, and in my world, everything was about making the perfect choice. The party was held at my family's estate, a sprawling mansion of cold stone and impeccable gardens that always felt more like a museum than a home. The air buzzed with the polite hum of the city's elite. Women in jewels that could fund small countries laughed with their teeth, while their husbands discussed mergers and acquisitions over glasses of champagne that cost more than my first car. A string quartet played Vivaldi in the corner, a soundtrack so perfectly elegant it was utterly forgettable. I stood at the center of it all, a sculpture on a pedestal, wearing a white dress that was demure yet astronomically expensive. Liam's hand rested on the small of my back, a touch that was meant to be possessive but felt more like a brand of ownership, light and proprietary. He smiled when people approached, a dazzling, easy smile that never quite reached his eyes. "We're so happy for you both," they'd say, their eyes flicking from Liam's perfect posture to the diamond on my finger. A perfect match. And we would smile and nod, the perfect couple, a living embodiment of their values. My father was in his element, a king surveying his court. Arthur Vance didn't just walk through a room, he conquered it. He moved with a heavy, deliberate confidence, shaking hands, clapping backs. His voice, a low rumble that commanded attention. I watched him across the ballroom as he stood with Liam's father, the two of them looking less like future in-laws and more like two CEOs finalizing a historic deal, which, in a way, they were. Later, he raised his glass for a toast. The room fell silent. "To my daughter Alara," he began, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before landing on me. There was pride in his gaze, but it was the pride of a collector displaying his most prized possession. And to Liam, a young man of remarkable character and even more remarkable business sense. The crowd chuckled politely. "This isn't just a marriage," my father continued, his voice booming slightly. "It is an alliance, a joining of two great families, two great legacies that will build a stronger future for us all." He looked at Liam, not me, when he said that last part. I felt a chill, despite the warmth of the room. I was not a bride. I was collateral. I was the beautiful, silk-wrapped seal on a contract. Liam leaned in and whispered, "Your father is quite the orator." His breath smelled of mint and champagne, clean and sterile. I smiled, the practiced, gentle curve of my lips that I had perfected over years. "He's just proud," I murmured back. Liam squeezed my hand. "As he should be. You look breathtaking tonight, Alara. That dress, an impeccable choice. An impeccable choice. Not that I was beautiful, but that my choice of attire was correct. It was a compliment to my taste, my adherence to the unwritten rules of our class, not to the woman wearing the fabric." That was Liam. He appreciated my aesthetic, my pedigree, my value as an asset. I wasn't sure he had ever stopped to consider my soul. His kiss, when he occasionally bestowed it upon me, was dry and brief, a gesture for public consumption. Our intimacy was a quiet, scheduled affair, as neatly managed as his investment portfolio. Always pleasant, always predictable, and utterly devoid of the messy, consuming fire I secretly read about in novels. I excused myself at one point, needing a moment of air. I stepped out onto the stone terrace, the cool night air a welcome shock. Beyond the perfectly manicured lawns, the city glowed against the dark sky, a wild, untamed beast. I could hear the faint, distant wail of a siren, a sound of emergency, of life happening in all its raw, unpredictable glory. And I felt a pang of longing so sharp it was a physical pain in my chest. I had everything a woman was supposed to want: security, wealth, a handsome, respectable husband-to-be. My life was a smooth, placid lake, reflecting a perfect, cloudless sky. But I was dying of thirst. I was drowning in the sheer, suffocating perfection of it all. I wanted a storm. I wanted waves. I wanted to feel something, anything, that wasn't planned, approved, and sanitized for my own good. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the French doors. A perfect girl in a perfect dress, with a perfect smile and dead eyes. I didn't know it then, but I was already searching for a way out. I was a prisoner begging for a liberator, and I didn't care if he came in the form of a savior or a destroyer. I stood there, listening to the muffled sounds of my own engagement party, and I made a silent, desperate wish to the chaotic city skyline. Break me, I thought. Somebody please, just break this perfection into a million pieces. The fateful moment didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with a quiet shift in the atmosphere. It was months after the engagement party, at the annual Civic Benefactors Gala, a night where the city's old money and new power pretend to care about art. I was there, of course, a permanent fixture at Liam's side. He wore his tuxedo with the same comfortable ease he wore his ambition, navigating the sea of influential faces with a practiced smile. My father was holding court near the grand staircase, his voice a low, confident growl as he dictated his opinions on the market to a circle of nodding acolytes. I felt the familiar weight of their world settle on my shoulders, the polite boredom, the sense of being a beautiful, well-behaved ghost. My role was simple: to be seen, to be admired, and to be silent. To escape, I drifted towards the contemporary wing, a cavernous white room filled with pieces of art that were too loud, too strange, too honest for most of the gala's attendees. They preferred the soft landscapes and stately portraits in the main hall. Here, the art screamed and bled and tore itself apart. It felt like a kindred spirit, and that's where I saw him for the first time in person. He was standing before a brutalist sculpture, a twisted mass of rebar and blackened steel that looked like a fallen angel. I knew who he was instantly: Julian Thorne. I had seen his face in the financial pages, usually next to a headline that made my father spit curses into his morning coffee. He was younger than I expected, perhaps late 30s, with an athlete's lean build that his tailored suit couldn't fully conceal. He stood with an unnerving stillness, a predator at rest, completely ignoring the social ballet happening a room away. He wasn't working the crowd. He was simply observing, and there was more power in his quiet solitude than in all my father's boisterous networking. He was the enemy, the wolf at the door, the living embodiment of the threat to my family's legacy. I should have turned and walked away. I should have sought the safety of Liam's predictable conversation. Instead, I found myself walking slowly, almost involuntarily, towards the same sculpture, pretending to study it from a different angle. He didn't turn his head, but I felt his awareness of me, a subtle shift in his posture. His voice, when it came, was low and calm, yet it cut through the cavernous space and found me. "It's meant to be ugly, isn't it?" he said, his eyes still fixed on the metal. "It's meant to make us uncomfortable." I was startled that he spoke to me, and even more startled by the question. People in our circle didn't discuss the feeling of art. They discussed its price tag. I found myself saying, my voice a little unsteady, "it's meant to be honest. Some things aren't beautiful." He finally turned to look at me, and the full force of his attention was like a physical touch. His eyes were a dark, unreadable gray, and they held my gaze without apology. He had a faint white scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny imperfection that made his handsome face seem dangerous and real. "Honest," he repeated, tasting the word. "I like that." He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You're Alara Vance. You manage the Callaway Gallery." It wasn't a question, he knew. The fact that he knew my professional role, separate from my identity as Arthur Vance's daughter, sent a small, illicit thrill through me. "And you're Julian Thorne," I replied, my voice gaining a little more strength. My father's favorite topic of conversation, a flicker of amusement in his dark eyes. "I imagine I am. But we're not talking about your father, we're talking about this. What does a piece like this say to you?" And just like that, he had created a bubble around us, a private world in the middle of a crowded room. Liam would have glanced at it and called it an interesting investment. My father would have dismissed it as pretentious junk. Julian was asking what it made me feel. For 10 minutes we spoke. We spoke of art, of the difference between passion and commerce, of the courage it takes to create something honest in a world that rewards polite fictions. He listened with an intensity that was unnerving. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to impress me with his own knowledge. He just watched my face, his gaze making me feel as though I was the only person in the universe. I felt my mind unfurling, my own opinions and thoughts coming to life after being dormant for so long. I gestured towards a specific weld on the sculpture, trying to explain a point about texture and violence. "You see how the artist fused it here? It's deliberately coarse." As my hand moved through the air, it brushed against his. It was nothing, a fleeting accidental contact of skin on skin. But a jolt, hot and electric, shot up my arm, making my breath catch in my throat. I pulled my hand back as if burned. His expression didn't change, but I saw something darken in his eyes, a recognition of the same current that had just passed between us. The air grew thick with unspoken words, with a sudden, terrifying awareness. The bubble popped when Liam's voice sliced through it. "Alara, there you are." He appeared at my side, placing his hand on my back in that familiar, proprietary way. He gave Julian a curt, dismissive nod, the kind one gives to the hired help. "Thorn," he said, the name a clipped insult. "Sterling," Julian replied, his voice a smooth, cool blade. His eyes, however, were still on me. He gave me a final, lingering look, a look that held 1,000 secret questions, and then he simply turned and walked away, melting back into the anonymous crowd. Liam didn't notice a thing. He was already steering me away, talking about some city councilman he wanted me to meet. "Stay away from him, by the way," Liam said offhandedly. "He's bad news. Dad says he's a snake." I nodded, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I was sure he could feel it. I felt dizzy, disoriented. The rest of the gala was a blur of faces and meaningless chatter. I smiled. I nodded. I played my part, but I wasn't there. I was still standing in front of that twisted metal sculpture, trapped in the force of Julian Thorne's gaze. The brief touch of his hand had burned a brand onto my skin. He hadn't just spoken to me, he had seen me. In a world where I was a carefully polished object, he had looked at me and seen a person. The wish I had made on the terrace of my engagement party, the desperate plea for something to break the perfection, echoed in my mind. The rock I had wished for had just appeared in the middle of my placid lake, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty that was equal parts dread and exhilaration, that I was going to swim towards it. A week after the gala, a package arrived at the gallery. It was a flat, rectangular box wrapped in simple brown paper, addressed to me personally, with no return address. My assistant, a sweet girl named Chloe, placed it on my desk with a curious look. "No sender," she noted. "Maybe a secret admirer." I laughed it off, but my heart gave a strange, nervous flutter. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a book. It wasn't just any book. It was a rare, out-of-print monograph on the very sculptor whose work had been our meeting point. It was a book I had mentioned in passing, a book I had been trying to track down for our gallery's library for years. Tucked inside the cover was a thick, cream-colored card with a single sentence written in bold, black ink. "For the woman who understands honesty. J.T. Julian Thorne." My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a bouquet of flowers or a piece of jewelry, the typical currency of men trying to impress. It was this, something deeply personal, something that said, "I heard you. I remember what matters to you." It was the most intimate gift I had ever received. My thank you was supposed to be a simple, professional courtesy. I found his corporate email address online and composed a short, formal note. "Mr. Thorne, the book arrived safely. It was an incredibly thoughtful and generous gesture. Thank you. Sincerely, Alara Vance." I hit send before I could lose my nerve, my finger hovering over the button. His reply came in less than 10 minutes. "Alara, I'm glad it found you. I find it's a waste for honest things to be locked away. I hope we can discuss it sometime. Julian." The shift from Mr. Thorne to Julian, from sincerely to his first name, was a deliberate crossing of a line. And with that, the floodgates opened. We began a secret correspondence, a hidden river of words flowing beneath the dry, sterile surface of my life. It started with the book, with art, but quickly, inevitably, it deepened. He had a way of asking questions that peeled back layers I didn't even know I had. He wasn't interested in the polite, curated version of Alara Vance. He wanted the raw, unedited director's cut. He would write about a brutal negotiation, the loneliness at the top, the constant fight to prove himself against men like my father who were born into power. And I, in turn, found myself confessing things I had never spoken aloud. I wrote about the suffocating weight of my family's expectations, about my fear that my life's path had been paved so smoothly I would never know what it felt like to walk on rough ground. I would be sitting across from Liam at dinner, listening to him detail a stock market fluctuation, while my phone vibrated silently in my lap with a message from Julian that made my mind and soul come alive. I was living two lives, and the secret one, the one that existed only in pixels and text, was starting to feel more real than my own. I would lock myself in the bathroom to read his words, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I was an addict, and he was my drug. After 2 weeks of this digital intimacy, his message changed. "I'm tired of reading your words," the text said one afternoon. I want to hear them. Coffee tomorrow? Someplace quiet. My world tilted on its axis. Moving from the safety of a screen to a face-to-face meeting was a monumental leap. It was one thing to engage in a secret emotional affair. It was another to commit a deliberate physical act of rendezvous. Every instinct for self-preservation screamed no. It was reckless. It was madness. But the thought of saying no, of severing this connection that had become my lifeline, was unbearable. I typed back a single word. Where? The place he chose was a small, dark cafe tucked away on a side street I had never been down, smelling of old books and freshly ground coffee. It was the kind of place you could disappear into. I saw him before he saw me, sitting at a small table in the back corner, staring out the window. In the daylight, away from the glitz of the gala, he looked less like a corporate titan and more like a man. A dangerously handsome man. When he looked up and saw me, his face broke into a slow, genuine smile that made my knees feel weak. "There you are," he said, standing up. The simple greeting felt impossibly intimate. Sitting across from him at that tiny table felt more real than my entire engagement party. The electricity that had sparked between us at the gallery was now a steady, humming current in the air. "You look different here," he said, his dark eyes studying my face, away from all the performance. I gave a shaky laugh. "I feel different." He leaned forward slightly, his presence commanding the space between us. "Tell me about her," he said, his voice a low murmur. "The woman who loves ugly art and feels trapped in a beautiful cage." The conversation flowed as easily as it had online, but with a new, charged intensity. The way he looked at me when I spoke, with his full, undivided attention, made me feel both completely exposed and perfectly safe. Then, he asked the question I had been dreading and longing for someone to ask my entire life. He looked straight at me, his gaze cutting through all my defenses. "This man, Liam Sterling," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Does he make you happy, Alara?" The question hung in the air between us. It wasn't accusatory or judgmental. It was a simple, honest inquiry, and in that moment I knew I could not lie to him. "Liam is a good man," I began, the standard, practiced response. "He's kind. He's stable." My voice trailed off. Julian just waited, his expression unwavering. And so, I told him the truth. "No," I whispered, the word tasting like freedom and treason on my tongue. "He doesn't make me happy. He makes me comfortable. And I'm starting to think that's worse." He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just nodded slowly, a deep understanding in his eyes that felt like a form of absolution. We sat in silence for a moment, the admission hanging between us, changing everything. When we finally left, he walked me to the corner. The autumn air was crisp, and the city felt different, brighter. There was no kiss, not even a touch, but as I turned to leave, his hand gently grazed my arm, a fleeting pressure that sent a shiver through my entire body. "Be careful, Alara," he said softly, and I couldn't tell if it was a warning or a promise. I walked home in a daze. I let myself into the perfect apartment I shared with Liam, the air sterile and silent. He was in his study, working. He looked up, smiled his pleasant, distant smile, and went back to his papers. That night, I lay in bed next to him, feeling like a spy in my own life. My body was here, in this quiet, orderly room, but my mind, my heart, my soul, they were all still in that dark cafe, sitting across from Julian Thorne. The seed of rebellion was no longer a seed. It had taken root, and I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that I would do anything to feel that alive again. The space between the desire and the act is a torturous, thrilling purgatory. After our coffee, my life was cleaved in two. There was the visible world where I smiled at Liam, discussed wedding venues with my mother, and offered polite critiques on art to wealthy patrons. Then there was the invisible world, a vibrant, secret landscape that existed only in my mind and on my phone, where every thought, every feeling, orbited Julian Thorne. We texted constantly, our conversations a tightrope walk between intellectual sparring and thinly veiled longing. We were circling each other, two predators locked in a dance, waiting for one to finally lunge. The lunge came on a rainy Tuesday night. I was with Liam at the opening of a new gallery, a cavernous space of polished concrete and exposed brick. Liam was in his element, shaking hands, talking capital, his presence a comforting, predictable anchor that I was beginning to resent. I felt like a vessel, a beautiful ship, moored in his safe harbor, while my soul yearned for a storm. And then I saw him. He was standing across the crowded room, leaning against a concrete pillar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He wasn't looking at the art, he was looking at me. Our eyes locked, and the entire room, with its chatter and clinking glasses, simply dissolved. There was an intensity in his gaze, a raw, possessive heat that traveled across the space and touched me like a physical caress. He knew I was with Liam. The knowledge seemed to amuse him, to fuel the fire in his eyes. He gave a slow, deliberate nod towards a dark hallway at the far end of the gallery, a hallway marked with a small sign that read, "Private collection, staff only." It was not a suggestion, it was a summons. My blood ran hot and cold. This was it, the moment of truth, the precipice I had been walking towards since I first met his gaze. I turned to Liam, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm just going to use the powder room," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm, foreign to my own ears. He just nodded, already distracted by a potential investor. I felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly consumed by a tidal wave of anticipation. Every step I took across that gallery floor was a betrayal. Every beat of my heart was a drumbeat leading me to my own execution, or my salvation. The hallway was dimly lit and silent. He was waiting for me at the end of it, standing before a heavy oak door. He didn't speak. He simply pushed the door open and held it, his eyes never leaving mine. I walked past him into the room, and the door clicked shut behind us, the sound as final as a gunshot. We were in a small storage space, filled with crated paintings and the smell of turpentine and dust. A single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting harsh shadows. The sudden silence was absolute, amplifying the sound of our breathing. He didn't move towards me right away. He just stood by the door, watching me, his presence filling the small room, sucking all the air out. The tension was a living thing. A vibrating wire pulled taut between us, and then it snapped. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, and all my resolve, all my carefully constructed morality, crumbled to dust. He backed me against a large, canvas-wrapped frame, his body caging mine. His hands came up to frame my face, his palms hot against my skin. "Alara," he breathed. My name, a rough, ragged sound, and then his mouth was on mine. It was not a kiss. It was a collision. It was frantic and desperate and utterly consuming. It was the taste of whiskey and longing and months of pent-up frustration. There was no tenderness in it, only a raw, savage hunger. His tongue plundered my mouth, and I met him with equal force, my own desperation rising to meet his. My hands tangled in his thick hair, pulling him closer, wanting to erase any space left between us. A low groan rumbled in his chest, and his hand slid from my face, down my neck, over my shoulders. One hand wrapped around my waist, arching me into him, while the other fumbled with the buttons of my silk blouse. There was a sharp tearing sound as a button gave way, and I gasped, not in protest, but in pure, unadulterated pleasure at his impatience. His fingers found the lace of my bra, his thumb stroking the curve of my breast through the thin fabric, sending shivers of lightning through my entire body. I moaned into his mouth, a helpless, broken sound. This was what I had been craving. This chaos, this loss of control, this raw, animalistic need. His hand slid from my waist, up my leg, under the hem of my dress. His fingers were hot and rough against the smooth skin of my thigh, tracing higher and higher towards the heat between my legs. I was dizzy, breathless, my entire world reduced to the feeling of his mouth on mine and his hand on my skin. He was going to take me, right here, standing up in a dusty storeroom, and the thought was the most terrifying and exhilarating thing I had ever known. Just as his fingers grazed the damp fabric of my underwear, he suddenly pulled back. We stood there, chests heaving, breathing in ragged gasps. His eyes were black with desire, his hair a mess, his lips swollen. I saw my own reflection in his dark pupils, a woman undone, her blouse torn, her face flushed with sin. The reality of what we had just done, of where we were, crashed down on us. The muffled sounds of the party outside the door were a sudden, harsh reminder of the world we had forgotten. "We can't," I whispered, the words feeling foolish and pointless now. "I know," he said, his voice hoarse, but his eyes said something else entirely. His eyes said, "This is only the beginning." With a strange, jarring tenderness, he reached out and gently tried to smooth the torn fabric of my blouse. The gesture was so intimate after the ferocity of the kiss that it made me want to weep. He straightened his own jacket, ran a hand through his hair, and became Julian Thorne, the businessman, once more. "You should go first," he murmured, his voice low and steady again. I nodded, unable to speak. I turned, my hand on the doorknob, and took one last look at him. The mask was back in place, but I could still see the fire smoldering in his eyes. I slipped out of the room, my body trembling, my mind a whirlwind. I walked back into the bright lights of the gallery, a ghost returning to her own life. Liam found me minutes later. "You were gone a while," he said, smiling his easy smile. "Everything okay?" I touched my swollen lips. I could still taste Julian. "Yes," I said, the lie smooth and practiced. "Everything is perfect." The kiss in the storeroom had lit a fuse, and for days I walked around in a state of controlled panic, waiting for the explosion. The world had become a thin, fragile veneer over a raging inferno of want. I could no longer look at Liam without seeing Julian's face. I could no longer sleep in our quiet, tasteful bedroom without imagining the chaos of Julian's touch. The decision had already been made in the tearing of a button, in the frantic press of our bodies. The only thing left was the surrender. It came 3 days later, a simple text message that landed on my phone screen like a thrown stone, shattering the placid surface of my afternoon. My place, 8 p.m. No more hiding. It wasn't a question. It was a command, a destination. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I would be there. The lie I told Liam was my most elaborate creation yet. It was a work of fiction, complete with a backstory and supporting characters. A celebratory dinner for an old friend from college, a friend Liam had never met. I described the restaurant we were supposedly going to. I lamented about the traffic I would likely hit. I felt a sick, twisting knot in my stomach as the easy, believable words flowed from my mouth. But beneath it was a dark, thrilling current of power. I was no longer a passive participant in my life. I was an active conspirator against it. I kissed Liam goodbye at the door, a chaste, fraudulent peck on the cheek, and the guilt felt distant, like a memory from another person's life. As the taxi carried me across town, away from the familiar, respectable neighborhood where I lived and towards the gleaming, anonymous towers of the financial district, I felt as though I were crossing a border into another country. A country where I could finally be myself, or at least discover who that self was. His penthouse was on the top floor. The private elevator opened directly into his living space, and I stepped out into a world of glass, steel, and silence. The apartment was vast and minimalist, furnished with impeccable, masculine taste. But the furniture was secondary to the view. 3 of the walls were floor-to-ceiling windows, revealing a breathtaking, panoramic vista of the glittering city. It was like standing at the edge of the world. He was waiting for me, standing by the window, a silhouette against the sea of lights. He had a glass of wine in his hand, and another waiting for me on a low marble table. "Welcome, Alara," he said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He didn't move to greet me, just watched me as I walked towards him, my heels clicking softly on the polished concrete floor. I took the glass he offered, my fingers brushing his. The same electric jolt, but this time, neither of us pulled away. We stood there for a long time, not speaking, just drinking our wine and looking out at the city, letting the silence and the anticipation build between us. Finally, he took the glass from my hand and set it aside. He turned to me, his dark eyes searching my face. "No more running," he whispered, and then he slowly, deliberately began to undress me. It was nothing like the frantic haste of the storeroom. This was a slow, deliberate act of worship. His fingers went to the buttons on my coat, sliding it from my shoulders and letting it fall to the floor. Then came the dress, the zipper, a slow, deliberate rasp against the silence. It pooled at my feet, leaving me standing before him in nothing but my delicate, expensive lingerie, the armor I had chosen for this battle. He didn't touch me yet. His eyes roamed over my body, a hot, possessive gaze that made my skin flush. He saw everything. He saw the gentle swell of my breasts, full and heavy above the lace of my bra, their peaks hardening under his stare. He saw the slender curve of my waist, the soft flare of my hips, the shadows that promised a deeper softness. He saw my long legs, the tremble I couldn't control. "Beautiful," he breathed, the word a reverent prayer. He knelt before me, his hands finally making contact, sliding up my calves, my thighs, his touch both firm and gentle. He unhooked my stockings and peeled them down my legs with agonizing slowness. Then he stood, his fingers finding the clasp of my bra. It fell away, and my breasts were free, aching for his touch. He obliged, his hands cupping them, his thumbs stroking my nipples until they were hard, sensitive points of fire. I gasped, my head falling back. Then his mouth replaced his hands, first on one breast, then the other, his tongue and lips creating a pleasure so intense it was close to pain. He laid me down on the vast, low bed, the cool silk sheets a shocking contrast to my heated skin. He stripped away my final piece of armor, his eyes drinking in the sight of my bare body, the soft mound of curls at the apex of my thighs, the place he had only brushed against in the darkness of the storeroom. I had never felt so naked, so exposed and yet so profoundly, powerfully desirable. He explored every inch of me with his hands and his mouth, a patient, devoted cartographer mapping a new world. He discovered the sensitive skin behind my knees, the hollow of my throat, the curve of my ass, which he kneaded and squeezed until I moaned his name. When his mouth finally moved lower, parting my folds, tasting me for the first time, a cry was torn from my throat. This was an intimacy I had never known, a worship I had never imagined. He brought me to a shattering climax before he had even shed a single piece of his own clothing, and as the waves of pleasure subsided, he rose above me and I finally saw all of him, his body lean and powerful, his erection, a hard, thick testament to his own desire. When he finally entered me, it was a slow, perfect invasion. I was more than ready for him, my own slick heat rising to meet his hardness. He pushed into me, filling me completely, and we both groaned at the sheer, perfect rightness of it. He began to move, a slow, deliberate rhythm that was about connection, not just friction. I wrapped my legs around his waist, pulling him deeper. The pace quickened, the rhythm becoming more primal. The sound of our skin slapping together was a wet, hypnotic beat in the silent room, a drum beat for our private ritual. My moans were no longer my own. They were torn from a deep, hidden part of me that he had unlocked. I looked into his eyes and saw my own wildness reflected back. He didn't look away. He saw all of it. He saw me. As the pressure built, as the final, explosive release approached, he leaned down and whispered in my ear, "You are mine, Alara." And as my world shattered into a million points of light, I knew he was right. Lying there afterwards, tangled in his arms, his heart beating steadily against my back, I looked out at the city lights. They no longer seemed distant or indifferent. They felt like a part of me, a reflection of the fire he had ignited inside me. I had not just had an affair, I had been reborn. Once you have tasted fire, you can never again be satisfied with mere warmth. My life, once a placid, predictable stream, had become a raging river, splitting into two divergent currents. One was the life everyone saw, the calm, sunlit surface where I was Alara Vance, dutiful fiancée to the impeccable Liam Sterling. The other was a deep, turbulent undertow, a secret world of shadows and heat that belonged only to me and Julian Thorne. The psychological toll of navigating these two currents was immense, a constant, grinding pressure. Yet, the ecstasy of the secret current was a drug I would not give up. Waking up in my own bed next to Liam became an exercise in profound dislocation. The morning after my first night in Julian's penthouse, I lay perfectly still, listening to the soft, even rhythm of Liam's breathing. The air in our bedroom smelled of clean linen and lavender-scented sleeping mist. It was the scent of safety, of order. But my skin still held the phantom scent of Julian's cologne, of sweat and sex and expensive whiskey. My body ached with a deep, satisfying soreness that was a testament to my betrayal. Liam stirred, rolling over to face me, his eyes fluttering open. He smiled, a soft, sleepy smile. "Morning," he murmured, leaning in to kiss my forehead. The gesture was so tender, so innocent, that it felt like a physical blow. Guilt, sharp and acidic, rose in my throat. This good, trusting man was sleeping next to a stranger. A liar. I was a traitor hiding in plain sight. "Morning," I whispered back, forcing a smile that felt like cracking porcelain. The days became a treacherous performance. I was an actress in the play of my own life, and my lines were lies. "I'll be working late at the gallery, darling. We have a new installation. Chloe and I are grabbing dinner after work. Don't wait up." My phone, once a simple tool, was now a sacred and dangerous object, a portal to my real life. It lived in a state of constant vigilance, screen down, notifications silenced. The thrill of seeing Julian's name flash on the screen was a jolt of pure adrenaline, a hit of the drug I craved. We met whenever we could, stealing hours from the days and nights. His penthouse became my sanctuary, my confessional, my playground. There, I was not Arthur Vance's daughter or Liam Sterling's fiancée. I was just Alara, a woman of flesh and blood and desire. Our lovemaking was no longer just about consummation. It became a language. There were frantic, desperate encounters against the glass walls, overlooking the city, and there were slow, languid afternoons spent tangled in his sheets, talking for hours after our bodies were spent. He listened to my frustrations. He challenged my ideas. He saw the intellect behind my eyes, not just the society girl on Liam's arm. He was nourishing a part of me that had been starving for years. The true madness of my situation was crystallized one Saturday afternoon. Liam, ever the diligent future husband, had scheduled us for a wedding cake tasting. We sat in a sterile, all-white bakery, surrounded by pristine sample cakes under glass domes. The air was thick with the scent of sugar and vanilla. Liam was earnestly discussing the structural integrity of a 5-tiered design with the baker. "We need something classic, elegant," he was saying. "Fondant, I think. Buttercream can be so unpredictable." He was so focused, so sincere in this absurdly trivial pursuit. And I sat there, smiling and nodding, while my phone rested in my lap, hidden beneath a brochure of floral arrangements. My thumbs were flying, deep in a text conversation with Julian. He had sent me an article about the political implications of a new artist's work. She argues that modern beauty standards are a form of capitalist oppression. "Thoughts?" Julian had texted. While Liam debated the merits of Swiss meringue, I was typing back to Julian, "It's not oppression, it's a distraction. They keep us so focused on perfecting the surface that we forget to cultivate what's inside. We become beautiful, empty houses. Alara, what do you think? The lemon with raspberry filling, or the classic vanilla bean?" Liam's voice pulled me back to the white, sugary room. I looked up, startled. "Oh, the vanilla," I said quickly. "Classic is always best." My phone buzzed in my lap. A new message from Julian. "Then let's burn the house down." A shiver went through me, a dangerous, exhilarating tremor. Just then, Liam leaned across the table to point at a design in the brochure, his face coming close to my lap, close to my phone. Julian's message was still on the screen. My blood turned to ice. With a speed I didn't know I possessed, I snapped the phone shut and covered it with my hand, my heart hammering in my chest. "Oh, look at this one," I said, my voice an octave too high, pointing randomly at a picture of a cake covered in hideous sugar flowers. Liam glanced up from the brochure, his eyes flicking to my phone, then back to my face. "Popular today," he said with a casual smile. "Must be Chloe with more wedding questions." He was completely oblivious. He trusted me so completely that the possibility of my deception didn't even exist in his universe. The weight of his trust was suffocating. I wanted to scream. I wanted to confess. But I also wanted to text Julian back. I started to see the lies reflected everywhere. My mother commented over lunch that I seemed to have a new glow. "You look so vibrant, dear," she said, squeezing my hand. "Love agrees with you." The irony was a bitter pill. It wasn't love, not Liam's comfortable, predictable love that made me glow. It was lust. It was transgression. It was the thrill of living on a razor's edge. That night, after the cake tasting and the close call, I stood before the mirror in the silent, perfect apartment I shared with Liam. I looked into my own eyes and saw the conflict raging there. I saw the guilt, the fear, the sheer exhaustion of maintaining the facade. But beneath it, I saw a spark, a wildness that had never been there before. I was a liar. I was a cheat. I was betraying a good man, but I had never, ever felt this alive. The psychological toll was a heavy tax, but the ecstasy it paid for was priceless. And I knew, as I stared at the stranger in the mirror, that I was willing to go bankrupt for it. As the weeks bled into a month, our affair began to shed its skin of frantic novelty and settled into something deeper, more dangerous. The initial, desperate need to simply possess each other gave way to a darker, more intricate exploration. It was no longer enough just to have the stolen hours. Julian wanted to explore the territory, to map the wilderness he had discovered inside me. Our encounters evolved from simple acts of passion into elaborate rituals of power, trust, and pleasure. He was no longer just my lover. He had become my guide into the most forbidden corners of my own desire, and I, his willing, eager student. One rain-swept evening, as we lay in his bed after a first, swift coupling, I felt a shift in him. He propped himself up on one elbow, his dark eyes studying me with an unnerving intensity. He reached over to the nightstand, his movements slow and deliberate, and picked up one of his silk ties. It was a deep charcoal gray, the same one he had worn to a business conference I'd seen him speak at on the news. He let it slither through his fingers like a living thing. My heart began to beat a little faster, a nervous, excited rhythm. "I want to try something," he said, his voice a low murmur that sent a shiver down my spine. "I want you to give me complete control. No holding back. No safety nets. Just surrender. Can you do that for me, Alara? Can you trust me that much?" He didn't wait for a verbal answer. He saw the yes in my wide, curious eyes. He saw the fear, but more importantly, he saw the hunger. He motioned for me to turn onto my stomach, and I obeyed, the cool silk sheets whispering against my skin. He gently took my wrists and, with the tie, bound them together behind my back. The knot was firm but not painful, the silk a cool, smooth restraint. A wave of profound vulnerability washed over me, so potent it was almost dizzying. For a woman who spent every waking moment of her real life maintaining a suffocating level of control, this complete and total surrender was terrifying. It was also the most liberating feeling I had ever known. With my hands bound, my other senses exploded into life. I could feel the slight dip in the mattress as he moved around the bed, the whisper of his breath near my ear, the intoxicating scent of his skin. "Now," he whispered, his voice a hot promise against my neck. "Now you can only feel." He did not enter me. Instead, he began a slow, meticulous worship of my body with his mouth. He kissed the backs of my knees, the curve of my spine, the sensitive hollows behind my ears. He learned my body better than I knew it myself, finding nerves I never knew existed, making me arch and tremble with just the flick of his tongue. The pleasure was so intense, so focused, it was agonizing. I was a finely tuned instrument, and he was a virtuoso, playing me with a maddening, exquisite skill. Then he moved lower, parting me with his fingers, and began to pleasure me with his mouth. Without the use of my hands to pull him closer or to anchor myself, I was adrift on a sea of sensation. The pleasure was pure, undiluted, and all-consuming. My quiet moans began to escalate, becoming louder, more desperate. I was begging him, though for what, I wasn't sure. For release, for more, for him to stop, for him to never stop. He brought me to the very edge of a climax, a shimmering, precipitous peak, and then he would pull back, letting me fall, only to start the slow, delicious torture all over again. A cry of frustration and longing was torn from my throat. It was a sound I didn't recognize, raw and animalistic. "Julian, please," I begged, the word a ragged sob. He chuckled, a low, dark sound of pure power. "Not yet," he said, his voice thick with his own arousal. After an eternity of this exquisite torment, just when I thought I would shatter from the sheer force of wanting, he untied my hands. My arms felt weak, useless. He pulled me up, my body pliant and boneless in his grasp, and led me from the bed. He walked me to the massive floor-to-ceiling window. The rain had stopped, and the city below was a glittering tapestry of light. He turned me around, pressing my back against the cool, hard glass. The sensation was a shock to my overheated skin. I could feel the faint vibration of the city through the window, and I felt utterly, thrillingly exposed. "Look," he commanded, his voice rough in my ear. He pointed to our reflection in the dark glass. It was a startling, erotic image. My naked, spent body pressed against the window, and his powerful form behind me, both of us framed by the billion lights of the city. We were gods in our glass tower, performing for an audience of no one and everyone. He entered me from behind, a single, deep, powerful thrust that drove the air from my lungs in a gasp. Against the glass, the feeling was impossibly intense. He moved within me, his rhythm hard and primal, his hands gripping my hips, pinning me to the window. He was no longer my gentle torturer. He was my captor, my conqueror. I watched our reflection as he drove into me, my head thrown back, my expression one of pure, ecstatic surrender. This was the peak. This was the reason for all the lies, all the guilt. This shattering, all-consuming release. The climax, when it came, was not a gentle wave, but a violent explosion. It ripped through me with the force of a lightning strike, and the moan that had been building in my chest was unleashed as a full-throated scream, my voice swallowed by the soundproof glass. I screamed his name, a desperate final act of capitulation. We collapsed to the floor, a tangle of sweat-slicked limbs, our bodies trembling in the aftershock. Lying there on the plush rug, my cheek against the floor, I looked at the woman reflected in the window above. She was wild, her hair a mess, her eyes dark and dazed. I didn't know her, but I wanted to. The affair had moved beyond a simple escape. It had become a journey into my own heart of darkness, and I knew without a single shred of doubt that I would follow Julian wherever he led me. The highest highs cast the darkest shadows. The secret world I had built with Julian was a dazzling, sun-drenched paradise, but the brighter it burned, the longer and more menacing the shadows grew in my real life. The ecstasy of my nights with him began to exact a heavy price on my days. I was living in a perpetual state of distraction, a ghost at the feast of my own life. My mind was a split screen. One side replaying the feel of Julian's hands on my skin, the other struggling to keep up with the mundane script of my reality. And people were starting to notice the facade, once so flawless, was beginning to show cracks. The first tremor came during a Sunday brunch with Liam and his parents. It was a torturously staid affair at their country club, filled with polite conversation about golf and the stock market. Mrs. Sterling, a woman with perfectly coiffed hair and a smile as thin as a razor wire, turned to me. "Alara, dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "I spoke with the calligrapher you recommended for the invitations. She said she was still waiting for your final approval on the font. We are cutting it a bit close, aren't we?" I stared at her blankly. The calligrapher. I had completely forgotten. My mind had been miles away, replaying a conversation I'd had with Julian the night before about Nietzsche. "Oh," I stammered, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "Yes, of course. It's been a busy week at the gallery. I'll call her first thing tomorrow." Liam shot me a look, not of anger, but of concerned confusion. The awkward silence that followed was deafening. Later, in the car, Liam's concern finally breached his usual placid demeanor. "Is everything all right, Alara?" he asked, his hands gripping the steering wheel. You seem elsewhere lately. At brunch, you were a million miles away. I bristled with a defensiveness born of pure guilt. I'm just stressed, Liam. The wedding, work, everything. It's a lot of pressure. It was a weak lie, and we both knew it. He didn't push, but the first hairline crack had appeared in the foundation of his trust. The earthquake, however, came from my father. A terse email from his assistant summoned me to his home office one evening. His study was the heart of his empire, a room of dark mahogany, leather-bound books he'd never read, and the faint, lingering scent of power and old cigars. It was where he broke his rivals and disciplined his family. I felt like a child being called to the principal's office. He was standing by the window when I entered, his back to me, looking down at the city he owned. "You wanted to see me?" I asked, my voice small in the cavernous room. He turned slowly. His face was a thundercloud. "Liam's mother called me," he began, his voice dangerously calm. "She's concerned. She finds your attitude towards the wedding preparations to be cavalier." He let the word hang in the air. "You forgot the calligrapher. You were rude to her cousin at the charity luncheon. You are distracted, distant, and frankly, you are embarrassing me. You are embarrassing the Vance name." I stood frozen, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "I've just been busy," I mumbled. "Busy?" He scoffed, taking a step closer. His eyes were like chips of ice. "Don't insult my intelligence. This alliance with the Sterlings is the most important strategic move our family has made in a decade. It secures our future. Your only job is to smile, be charming, and walk down the aisle. It is not a difficult task, Ilara, yet you seem to be failing at it." Then his tone shifted, becoming venomous. "I have enough on my plate as it is without having to worry about your moods. That bastard Thorne is trying a hostile takeover of a subsidiary. He's a goddamn vulture, picking at the edges of everything I've built, a street rat with a good suit." My blood ran cold. To hear him speak Julian's name with such pure, unadulterated hatred, while the memory of Julian's body intertwined with mine was still so vivid, it was a physical shock. I struggled to keep my expression a perfect, neutral mask, terrified that my eyes would betray me. I felt a dizzying, sickening vertigo, as if the floor was tilting beneath me. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked, my voice tight. "It has everything to do with you," he thundered, slamming his hand down on his massive desk. The sound made me jump. "It's about legacy. It's about strength. While I am fighting a war against parasites like Julian Thorne, I expect my own daughter to hold the line at home, not to be daydreaming and offending our most important allies. So I am asking you once, and only once, what is going on with you? Are you having second thoughts about Liam?" The question was a trap. Any answer other than a firm denial would be catastrophic. "No," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Of course not. I love Liam, I'm just tired." He stared at me for a long, agonizing moment, his eyes searching for the lie. Finally, he seemed to accept it, or at least to shelve it. "Then get yourself together," he said, his voice dropping back to its icy calm. "Fix it. Now, get out. I have calls to make." I fled his study, my heart pounding, my lungs burning. I felt violated, cornered. The two worlds I had so carefully kept separate had just collided with devastating force. My father was at war with my lover, and I was the battlefield, a no man's land, being torn apart by both sides. As soon as I was in my car, my hands trembling, I pulled out my phone. My fingers flew across the screen, a desperate, primal instinct for survival. All the joy, all the liberation I felt with Julian was now tangled up with fear and the ugly reality of my father's hatred. His penthouse was no longer just a playground. It was my only bomb shelter in the middle of a war zone. I sent the text, each word a plea. "I need you. Please. Can I see you now?" I hit send and stared at the screen, waiting for his reply. The walls were closing in. My father was suspicious. Liam was worried. And the elaborate architecture of my lies was groaning under the strain. The price of my secret ecstasy was becoming clearer, and I was terrified I wouldn't be able to afford it for much longer. His reply was a single word. "Come." I drove to his building on autopilot, my father's venomous words echoing in my ears, a toxic counterpoint to the frantic, desperate beating of my own heart. When he opened the door to his penthouse, he didn't need to ask what was wrong. He saw it in my wide, panicked eyes, in the tremor of my hands. I fell into his arms, burying my face in his chest, and for the first time that night, I let out a choked, ragged sob. He held me, his hands stroking my hair, his presence a solid, calming anchor in my storm-tossed world. He led me to the sofa, poured me a brandy, and listened as the whole ugly story of the confrontation with my father spilled out of me. He listened without interruption, his expression hardening as I spoke. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy, oppressive. He looked at me, his gaze direct and filled with a grim sympathy. "He's right to be worried," Julian said, his voice quiet but laced with steel. "Not about you and Liam, about me." A cold dread trickled down my spine. "What do you mean?" He took a slow sip of his own drink. "The deal he was talking about. The subsidiary. I'm not just trying to take it over, Alara. The final move is tomorrow morning. And it's not a takeover. It's a kill shot. If it works, Vance Industries will be crippled. He'll lose almost everything." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a distant business battle anymore. This was happening. Tomorrow. Julian, my lover, the man whose scent clung to my clothes, was about to financially ruin my father. The affair was no longer a secret garden. It was the epicenter of an earthquake about to devastate my entire world. I should have felt fury. I should have felt betrayed. But looking at him, at his honest, unyielding gaze, all I felt was a profound, soul-crushing wave of despair. It was over. We were over. The chasm between our worlds was about to become an uncrossable abyss. "Why are you telling me this?" I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Because you deserve the truth," he said. "And because I wanted to see you one more time before the war begins. One more time." The finality of it hung in the air, a death sentence. And in that moment, all the fear, all the guilt, all the impending loss coalesced into a single, overwhelming need. A need to feel him, to be inside his arms, to lose myself in him one last, desperate time, as if our passion could somehow hold back the dawn. I didn't say a word. I simply stood up, walked over to him, and pressed my mouth to his. The kiss was not tender. It was a desperate, frantic thing, a clash of teeth and tongues. It was a kiss of rage and grief, a futile attempt to devour each other, to absorb each other's essence before we were torn apart forever. There was no slow seduction, no patient exploration. This was raw, primal, and immediate. My hands tore at the buttons of his shirt while his fumbled with the zipper of my dress. We stumbled towards the bedroom, shedding clothes like soldiers shedding armor before a final, doomed charge. We fell onto the bed, a tangle of desperate limbs. This wasn't about pleasure, not in the way it had been before. This was an exorcism. Every thrust of his hips was a defiant scream against our fate. Every time my nails dug into the skin of his back, it was a protest against the world that had made our love impossible. The sounds we made were not the soft moans of lovers, but the guttural cries of wounded animals. We were two souls on the edge of an abyss, clinging to each other as the only solid thing in a universe that was crumbling to dust. His hands gripped my hips, his fingers digging into my flesh, bruising me, marking me as his, and I welcomed the pain. It was an anchor in the storm, a sharp, clear sensation in a world that had dissolved into chaos. He whispered my name over and over, a mantra, a prayer. I could taste the salt of my own tears on his lips, mingled with the sweat on his skin. This was our goodbye, written on each other's bodies. I looked into his eyes and saw my own desperation reflected there, my own heartbreak. And in them, for the first time, I also saw love. A tragic, doomed love that had never been spoken and now never would be. The climax, when it came, was a cataclysm. It was a beautiful, terrible agony, a wave of sensation so intense it felt like my very soul was being ripped from my body. It was a release not just of pleasure, but of all the pent-up fear, grief, and love that had been suffocating me for weeks. It was a small death, a final, shattering surrender. And then, it was over. We collapsed, our bodies slick with sweat, our lungs heaving. The silence that fell was heavier, more profound than any we had ever shared. It was the silence of the aftermath, the silence of the inevitable. We lay there for what felt like an eternity, not touching, two separate islands in the wreckage of our passion. The outside world, with its consequences and its impending doom, had finally breached the walls of our sanctuary. What happens now? I whispered into the darkness, the question sounding naive and childish. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered, his voice devoid of all its earlier fire. "I don't know," he said, and in those 3 words I heard the brutal, honest truth. There was no plan. There was no escape. This was the end of the line. Slowly, mechanically, I got out of bed and began to gather my clothes. Each movement was heavy, laden with the weight of our finality. He watched me dress, his face an unreadable mask of sorrow. When I was ready to leave, I walked to the door and paused, looking back at him, wanting to memorize the sight of him in this room, our room, for the last time. There was nothing left to say. Our bodies had said it all. I walked out without a word, the click of the door closing behind me as final as a coffin lid. The elevator ride down was a slow descent into my new reality. I had reached the absolute zenith of desire, the highest peak of risk, and I had thrown myself willingly into the fire. And as the doors opened to the cold, empty lobby, I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that the only thing left for me now was the fall. The abyss was waiting. The end did not come like a slow, creeping dawn. It came like a lightning strike from a clear sky, a sudden, violent cataclysm that vaporized my world in a single, blinding flash. For 2 days after my last desperate night with Julian, I existed in a state of suspended animation, a numb, waiting dread. The news broke on a Thursday morning. It was everywhere. On every financial channel, on every newspaper's front page. Julian Thorne's audacious, brilliant maneuver was complete. He had won. Vance Industries was crippled, my father's legacy gutted. The war was over. I felt a strange, hollow emptiness. My lover had destroyed my father, and I waited for the fallout, knowing with a bone-deep certainty that the corporate devastation was only the first wave of the storm. The call came that evening. It was my father. His voice was unnaturally calm, devoid of any emotion. It was the most terrifying sound I had ever heard. "Be at the house in 1 hour," he said. "And Alara? Don't be late. Liam is already here." The line went dead. "Liam is already here." The words echoed in the silent apartment, a death knell. This wasn't about the business, he knew. My heart didn't pound. It simply stopped. A cold, heavy stillness spread through my veins. The drive to my parents' estate was surreal. The familiar streets looked alien, as if I were seeing them through the eyes of a condemned woman on her way to the gallows. There was no panic left, no frantic scramble for a lie. There was only the quiet, calm certainty of absolute ruin. I had been living on a precipice for months, and the ground had finally given way. I was already falling. This was just the formality of the impact. I was escorted to his study. The heavy oak doors seemed to close, with a final, booming finality behind me. The scene was a tableau of judgment. My father sat enthroned behind his massive desk, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. And by the unlit fireplace, staring into the black hearth, was Liam. He didn't turn when I entered. He just stood there, his back rigid, a statue of grief. The air in the room was thick, heavy, and suffocating with unspoken words. "Sit," my father commanded. I did not. I remained standing in the center of the room, a defendant before her judges. My father stared at me, his eyes 2 black holes of contempt. "I made a mistake," he began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "I thought my greatest enemy was Julian Thorne. I spent a fortune on private investigators, trying to find a weakness, a secret I could use to destroy him." He paused, letting the silence stretch. He slid a thick, manila envelope across the polished surface of his desk. It landed with a soft, final thud. I was looking in the wrong place. My greatest enemy, my greatest weakness, was in my own house all along. My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope. I didn't need to open it. I already knew. But I forced myself to look. The pictures were glossy, clinical, and utterly damning. Me, leaving Julian's apartment building in the early morning light, my hair a mess, my dress rumpled from the night before. Another shot, a close-up through a telephoto lens, showed me kissing him in his car a few weeks prior. Each photo was a nail hammered into my coffin. I felt the blood drain from my face. There was no defense. There was only the cold, hard photographic truth. You didn't just sleep with him. My father's voice was laced with a chilling venom now. You slept with the man who was actively plotting my ruin. While I was fighting for the life of this family, you were in the enemy's bed. You didn't just betray your fiancé. You didn't just betray me. You betrayed this entire family. You spat on our name. His voice rose with every word, the mask of control finally cracking to reveal the raging inferno beneath. You are a disgrace. A whore who gave herself to the man who slit her own father's throat. The words struck me, but I barely felt them. My entire being was focused on the silent figure by the fireplace. Liam. He finally turned, and the sight of his face was my true punishment. There was no anger there, no rage. That would have been easier to bear. Instead, his face was a void. It was empty, hollowed out, as if his soul had been scooped out, leaving nothing but a shell. His eyes, usually so full of gentle kindness, were vacant, shattered. He looked at me, really looked at me, and it was like being seen by a ghost. He said nothing. He simply walked to the desk, his movements slow and robotic. He reached into his pocket and pulled out my engagement ring. I hadn't even realized I wasn't wearing it. He must have seen it on my bedside table. He placed it gently on the desk next to the damning photos. The diamond glittered under the lamplight, a tiny, magnificent monument to a future that was now dead. It was the loudest silence I had ever heard. And then, without another glance, he turned and walked out of the room, out of the house, out of my life, forever. His quiet, dignified departure was more devastating than all of my father's shouting. It was a clean amputation. With Liam gone, my father's rage seemed to cool, settling into something far colder and more permanent. "He is a better man than you deserve," he said flatly, "and you are no longer welcome in his life or in mine. As of this moment, you are no longer my daughter. The trust funds will be frozen. Your access to all family accounts is revoked. You will pack a bag and you will be out of this house tonight. I never want to see your face again." I stood there, mute, unable to process the sheer totality of the destruction. My fiancé was gone. My family was gone. My home was gone. My entire life, the gilded cage I had both cherished and despised, had been utterly and completely annihilated. I had nothing. I was nothing. I had flown too close to the sun, and now, with my wax wings melted away, I was left with only the long, terrifying fall. The storm had passed, and I was left standing alone in the ruins. It has been 6 months since the storm, or perhaps it has been a lifetime. I live in a different city now, a place where the sky is often a soft, forgiving gray, and the rain washes the streets clean. My name is different, my hair is cut short, and my life is unrecognizably small. I live in a third-floor apartment above a quiet bookstore, and the scent of old paper and coffee is the first thing I smell in the morning. There are no silk sheets, no penthouse views, no diamonds winking at me with malevolent light. My world is a landscape of simple, mundane things. The weight of a grocery bag in my arms, the warmth of a ceramic mug, the rhythm of my own 2 feet on the pavement. I am utterly, completely alone. And in the dead of night, when the city is asleep, I stare at my ceiling and I trace the geography of my ruin. I never heard from Julian again. After that final, cataclysmic night, he vanished from my life as completely as he had entered it. He won his war. I saw his face on the cover of a business magazine a few months ago at a newsstand. He looked powerful, confident, triumphant. The article detailed his brilliant, ruthless victory over Arthur Vance. There was no mention of me. I was a footnote in his story, a secret weapon he had deployed and then discarded. Sometimes I wonder if he ever loved me, or if I was just the most satisfying part of his revenge against my father. A way to not only conquer his rival's empire, a way to own his most prized possession. I have come to believe it was both, and I do not know which is worse. Liam, I hear, is engaged again. I saw a small announcement online in the society pages I used to be a part of. The girl is perfect, of course, from a good family, beautiful, safe. I felt a sharp, unexpected pang of pain when I saw their smiling photo. It wasn't a pang of longing for him, but a deep, aching regret for the casual cruelty of my betrayal. I took his gentle, trusting heart, and I shattered it, not out of malice, but out of a selfish need to feel something. He was the true casualty in my war, the only innocent, and that is a debt I will carry with me forever. My father and I have not spoken. The day after I was cast out, my mother arranged for a few of my things to be sent to a storage unit. It was a cold, transactional affair, handled through assistance. Arthur Vance had amputated me from the family legacy as cleanly as a surgeon removing a gangrenous limb. I know that he is rebuilding, that his company survived, wounded but not dead. My father is a survivor, but I know that when he looks at his empire now, he will always see the scar that I left, the stain of my dishonor. I destroyed the one thing he truly valued, the illusion of a perfect, powerful dynasty. And so, I am left only with the truth. I sit in my small, quiet room, and I sift through the ashes of the life I burned to the ground. Do I regret it? Yes. I regret the pain. I regret the wreckage. But do I regret the feeling of being alive? Do I regret the moments of pure, unadulterated passion in Julian's arms, the feeling of being truly seen, of being wanted with a ferocity that bordered on madness? To regret that would be the final lie. He woke me from a long, dreamless sleep, and even if the waking world turned out to be a nightmare, I cannot bring myself to regret the act of opening my eyes. My great tragedy was not that I fell in love with the wrong man. My great tragedy was that I had never learned to love myself at all. I was a reflection, an object whose value was determined by the man who possessed her. First, I was my father's asset, a beautiful piece of his portfolio. Then, I was Liam's perfect partner, the finishing touch on his perfect life. And finally, I became Julian's obsession, a symbol of his conquest, the ultimate prize in his war. I leaped from one gilded cage straight into the heart of a wildfire, never realizing that the door to both cages had been unlocked the entire time. I just never thought to walk out on my own. Now there are no cages. There is no fire. There is only the silence, the quiet, and the slow, arduous work of building a life from the bedrock up. Some nights, the ghost of his touch is so real, I gasp in the darkness. I remember the taste of his mouth, the weight of his body on mine, the way he would say my name, and the loneliness is a physical presence, a cold weight in my bed, but it passes. The ghosts are beginning to fade. For the first time, I am defined by no one. I am not a daughter, a fiancée, or a mistress. I am simply a woman who buys her own groceries, who pays her own rent, who watches the rainfall on a city that doesn't know her name. It is a terrifying and strangely peaceful existence. The fire that was Julian Thorne warmed me, and then it burned me. It burned everything down. But sometimes, in the ashes, after the fire has passed, the soil is more fertile than it ever was before. And something new, something small and quiet and entirely your own, finally has the chance to grow.